Turin, Italy, January 3, 1889. A man runs through the Piazza Carlo Alberto toward a horse being beaten by its driver. The horse is old, exhausted, collapsing under its burden. The driver curses and strikes it again and again with a whip, trying to force movement from the dying animal. The man watching cannot bear it. He pushes through the crowd, throws his arms around the horse's neck, and begins weeping. He whispers to the animal, apologizing, calling it his friend. Tears stream down his face. Then he collapses onto the cobblestones, unconscious. Bystanders carry him back to his lodgings at Via Carlo Alberto 6. His landlord puts him to bed. For 2 days he lies there, sometimes lucid, sometimes raving. He writes letters signed Dionysus and the Crucified. He claims to have ordered the German emperor to come to Rome. He says he is having all anti-Semites shot. He declares that the world is transfigured, that everything is perfect now, that he has succeeded. His friend Franz Overbeck arrives from Basel, summoned by alarmed letters. He finds Nietzsche singing, shouting, pounding the piano with his fists. Nietzsche recognizes him briefly, then doesn't. "I know you came because of me," he says. Then, "Why are you here?" Then he begins singing again. Overbeck takes him back to Basel, to a psychiatric clinic. The diagnosis is progressive paralysis, tertiary syphilis destroying his brain. The greatest philosophical mind of the 19th century has been extinguished. Friedrich Nietzsche is 44 years old. He will live another 11 years in complete mental darkness, recognizing no one, speaking gibberish when he speaks at all, cared for like a large child by his mother and then his sister. But here's what haunts everyone who studies Nietzsche. Was the madness sudden? Or had it been approaching for years, visible in his writing, present in the increasingly grandiose claims, the violent mood swings, the physical deterioration he documented obsessively? Can we separate the philosophy from the disease? Or was the philosophy itself a symptom, the thinking of a brain already beginning to fail? The final productive year of Nietzsche's life was 1888. In those 12 months, he wrote with demonic intensity, producing 5 books including his most extreme works, The Antichrist, Ecce Homo, Twilight of the Idols, The Case of Wagner, and Nietzsche contra Wagner. The writing is brilliant and unhinged, profound and megalomaniacal, prescient and insane. This is the story of those final years, from 1885 to 1889, when Nietzsche's thinking reached its peak, and his mind began its collapse. When he wrote his most important works, while slowly losing the ability to think at all. When he proclaimed himself a destiny while becoming a medical case. When he tried to revalue all values, while his own values were being destroyed by disease. The tragedy of Nietzsche is not just that he went mad, it's that we'll never know how much of his philosophy emerged from genius and how much from illness. It's that his sister corrupted his legacy to serve fascism he would have despised. It's that he spent his final years as a tourist attraction, a living corpse displayed to visitors who came to stare at the famous philosopher reduced to vegetable. It's that everything he tried to accomplish was undermined by forces he couldn't control: disease, family betrayal, historical misappropriation. Act 1. The Isolation. The Wanderer. By 1885, Nietzsche had become a ghost. He had resigned his professorship at Basel University in 1879 due to chronic illness. For 6 years he had wandered through Europe, staying in cheap boarding houses, moving constantly, searching for climate that might ease his suffering. His health was catastrophic. Migraine headaches attacked him regularly, pain so severe he would lie in darkened rooms for days, unable to read or write or think. His eyesight was failing, forcing him to write in huge letters, to hold books inches from his face. His stomach rejected most food. He vomited frequently, suffered from constant digestive agony. He tried every cure available: specialized diets, water treatments, electrical therapy, chloral hydrate for sleep, various medications that did nothing or made things worse. He consulted dozens of doctors who offered contradictory diagnoses and useless treatments. Nothing helped. The suffering continued. He lived on a tiny pension from Basel, barely enough for modest lodgings and simple food. He had no permanent home, no stable relationships, no community. His few remaining friends received letters but rarely saw him. He was alone, wandering, sick, unknown. His book sold almost nothing. Thus Spoke Zarathustra, which he considered his masterpiece, sold perhaps 40 copies in its first year. Publishers rejected his work or published it at his own expense. Reviewers ignored him. The philosophical establishment dismissed him as a failed philologist who had gone mad and turned to philosophy. But he kept writing. Despite the headaches, despite the near blindness, despite the isolation and poverty and pain, he wrote. Ideas poured out of him with increasing intensity. He was discovering things, he believed, that no one had seen before. He was dismantling 2,000 years of lies. He was preparing to revalue all values. The loneliness was crushing. He had broken with Richard Wagner, his former idol, over Wagner's anti-Semitism and Christian nationalism. He had alienated academic colleagues with his increasingly radical ideas. His family didn't understand him. His mother and sister were conventional Christians who considered his philosophy dangerous blasphemy. He proposed marriage to Lou Salome, a brilliant Russian woman who rejected him decisively. The rejection devastated him, exposed his desperate need for connection, for someone who understood what he was trying to do. She saw his genius, but also saw something unstable, something heading toward breakdown. She later wrote about him with mixture of admiration and pity, recognizing both his brilliance and his fundamental unsuitability for normal human relationships. So he wandered alone through Switzerland, Italy, France, the French Riviera, always moving, never settling, searching for something he couldn't name. Climate, he told himself. Health. The right conditions for thought. But really he was running from the isolation he couldn't escape because it was inside him. In letters to friends, he described his daily routine with obsessive detail. He woke at specific times, ate specific foods, walked specific routes, maintained rigid schedules designed to manage his health. The rigidity was an attempt to control the chaos overwhelming him. If he could just find the right routine, the right climate, the right conditions, perhaps the suffering would ease. It never did. Every new location brought temporary hope followed by the same pain. Nice, Turin, Sils Maria, Venice, each promised relief and delivered more suffering. The geography changed, but the agony followed him everywhere because it wasn't in the climate. It was in his body, in his brain, in the disease already destroying him. He documented everything in letters and notebooks. The temperature of his room, the quality of his meals, the intensity of his headaches on a scale of his own devising. The number of hours he could work before pain forced him to stop. He was conducting an experiment on himself, gathering data, hoping to find patterns that might reveal solutions. The patterns he found were discouraging. Nothing worked consistently. Remedies that helped once failed the next time. Locations that seemed ideal became unbearable. His body was betraying him systematically, and no amount of careful observation could prevent or predict the betrayals. The mountaintop. In the summer of 1881, walking near Lake Silvaplana in the Swiss Alps, Nietzsche had an experience that would become central to his philosophy. He claimed that the idea of eternal recurrence came to him there, beside a massive pyramidal rock, with absolute certainty and overwhelming force. Eternal recurrence, the idea that time is infinite and matter finite, so eventually every configuration of matter must repeat. Everything that has happened will happen again, infinitely. Your life, exactly as you've lived it, will recur eternally. Every joy, every suffering, every mistake, every triumph over and over forever. Most people would find this horrifying. Living this life once is difficult enough. Living it infinitely, unable to change anything, condemned to repeat every failure and humiliation eternally, unbearable. But Nietzsche saw it as the ultimate test. Can you say yes to your life? Not just the good parts, but everything, the suffering and mistakes included? Can you will the eternal return of your existence exactly as it is? If you can, you're affirming life completely. If you can't, you're living wrong, wishing for different life, denying existence. He claimed this thought almost destroyed him. The weight of it, the demand for total life affirmation, seemed more than any human could bear. But he also saw it as liberation. If everything recurs, then nothing is wasted. Every moment has infinite significance because it will return forever. This idea marked a turning point. Before eternal recurrence, Nietzsche was a brilliant critic, dismantling Christianity and traditional morality with devastating precision. After eternal recurrence, he became prophet, announcing new values, calling for transformation of humanity itself. Thus spoke Zarathustra emerged from this experience. Nietzsche claimed he wrote it in states of inspiration bordering on possession, ideas flooding through him faster than he could write. The prose is unlike anything else in philosophy, poetic, rhythmic, full of images and parables, deliberately biblical in style, while preaching the death of God. Zarathustra is a prophet who comes down from the mountains to teach humanity that God is dead, that humans must overcome themselves, that the goal is the Übermensch, the overman who creates his own values and affirms existence completely. The first part was written in just 10 days in 1883. Nietzsche later described the experience as automatic writing, as if the book was dictating itself to him. He would wake with phrases fully formed, would walk in the mountains, and return with entire sections composed in his head. The creative intensity was unlike anything he'd experienced before. The book sold almost nothing. Critics dismissed it as pretentious nonsense, philosophy dressed up as bad poetry. Nietzsche was crushed, but also convinced that the world simply wasn't ready. His time would come, he believed. Future generations would recognize what his contemporaries couldn't see. This belief sustained him through the isolation but also fed growing megalomania. If the world doesn't recognize your genius, you can conclude you're wrong or that the world is blind. Nietzsche chose the latter. Everyone else was blind. He alone saw clearly. His isolation proved his superiority. He began comparing himself to the greatest figures in history, not metaphorically but literally. He was changing human consciousness as profoundly as Buddha or Christ had, he believed. His books would eventually be recognized as sacred texts, foundational for new civilization that would emerge from Christianity's death. Friends who visited him during this period were disturbed by the grandiosity. The quiet scholar they'd known at Basel had transformed into prophet, convinced of world historical importance. His letters contained claims that seemed delusional. That he was the most important thinker alive. That his work would transform everything. That he represented a turning point in human evolution. But were these claims delusional? Or was Nietzsche simply recognizing his own importance before the world did? The question haunts every attempt to understand his final years. Megalomania and accurate self-assessment can look identical when the person really is that important. The eternal recurrence doctrine also reveals something about Nietzsche's relationship to his own suffering. He needed a philosophy that would make his pain meaningful. If life recurs eternally, then his headaches, his loneliness, his poverty, all of it has cosmic significance. It's not just random bad luck, but part of the eternal pattern that he must will to return. This is either profound or pathological. Profound if it genuinely enables life affirmation despite suffering. Pathological if it's just elaborate rationalization for why someone won't seek help for obvious problems. With Nietzsche, perhaps it's both simultaneously. Beyond Good and Evil. In 1886, Nietzsche published Beyond Good and Evil, his most systematic philosophical work. The title announces his project, moving past traditional morality into new territory, where conventional categories no longer apply. The book attacks everything. Democracy is herd mentality, the weak banding together to suppress the strong. Equality is lie, denying obvious natural hierarchies. Compassion is weakness disguised as virtue. Truth itself might be less valuable than certain life-affirming illusions. He develops his concept of will to power. The fundamental drive underlying all life is not survival or reproduction, but expansion, growth, overcoming resistance. Everything alive seeks to become more, to exert force, to impose itself on the world. Morality is just will to power in disguise, the weak trying to constrain the strong through guilt and obligation. Philosophers have always claimed to seek truth objectively. Nietzsche argues they're lying or deluded. Every philosophy is confession of its creator's drives and needs. Plato's otherworldly forms reflect his disgust with physical reality. Christian morality reflects resentment of the powerless against the powerful. Kant's categorical imperative reflects German rigidity and need for absolute rules. There is no view from nowhere, no objective truth independent of perspective. All thinking is interpretation, shaped by drives and needs the thinker doesn't acknowledge. Honest philosophy would admit this, would acknowledge that it's creating values rather than discovering them. The book is brilliant and disturbing. Nietzsche dismantles foundations of Western thought with surgical precision. But what remains after the demolition? If there's no objective truth, no universal morality, no reason to prefer any values over any others, then what? Nietzsche's answer is aristocratic radicalism. Superior individuals should create their own values, live according to their own nature, stop being constrained by herd morality designed for mediocre masses. The future belongs to those strong enough to live without the crutches of God, universal truth, or objective morality. This is exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because it promises freedom from all external authority. Terrifying because it removes all constraints, all shared values, all common ground. If everyone creates their own values, how do we live together? How do we prevent might makes right from becoming only principle? Nietzsche doesn't adequately answer this. He's more interested in destruction than construction, better at critique than creation. He knows what he's against. What he's for remains vague: strength, creativity, life affirmation, becoming who you are. Beautiful phrases that don't translate into clear principles. The book also reveals his increasing contempt for humanity. Most people are herd animals, he insists, incapable of independent thought, needing to follow leaders and obey rules. They cannot handle freedom or create their own values. They need religion and morality to constrain them because without external authority, they would descend into chaos. Only rare individuals, the future philosophers and artists and leaders, can transcend herd mentality. They're the ones Nietzsche is writing for. Everyone else will misunderstand or reject his work, which is fine because it's not meant for them. This creates paradox. Nietzsche attacks morality as constraint on the strong, but he also recognizes that without morality, most people would be dangerous. So morality is necessary for the herd, but prison for exceptional individuals. The solution is aristocratic society where different rules apply to different people. This is deeply problematic. Who decides who's exceptional? How do we prevent every narcissist and sociopath from claiming exception from moral rules? Nietzsche's answer is that truly exceptional people will prove themselves through achievements. But Hitler and Stalin also proved themselves through achievements. Exceptional ability doesn't guarantee moral wisdom. The book sold poorly, like everything Nietzsche published, a few hundred copies over several years. His reputation among professional philosophers was non-existent. He was considered a curiosity at best, a madman at worst. The few readers he had were often disturbed by what they found. But Nietzsche was convinced that this proved his point. The herd couldn't understand him. Only future exceptional individuals would recognize his importance. He was writing for people who didn't exist yet, for the Übermenschen, who would eventually emerge and vindicate his vision. The genealogy. In 1887, Nietzsche published On the Genealogy of Morals, his most focused and sustained argument. The book traces the origins of moral concepts, showing how they emerged from power struggles rather than rational insight or divine revelation. The first essay distinguishes master morality from slave morality. Masters, the powerful and noble, create values based on what they are: strong, proud, active, beautiful. Good means them. Bad means everything weak and common and beneath them. Their morality is affirmation of their own excellence. Slaves, the powerless, create morality through resentment. Unable to overcome their masters physically, they do it morally. They declare that the masters are evil, that power and pride are sins, that the qualities of the powerless, humility, compassion, altruism, are virtuous. Good becomes defined as opposite of what the masters are. Christianity is slave morality's greatest triumph. It took the values of the powerless and declared them divine truth. The meek shall inherit the earth. The poor are blessed. The powerful are condemned. Its brilliant revenge. conquering through morality what couldn't be conquered through force. The second essay explores guilt and bad conscience. How did humans develop conscience? That internal judge that makes us feel guilty for our own desires. Nietzsche's answer is brutal, through violence. Social organization required suppressing natural aggression. People who couldn't attack others turned aggression inward, creating bad conscience, guilt for being what they are. Christianity weaponized this. It declared humans fundamentally sinful, guilty of existing. Then it offered salvation through submission to God. The psychology is perfect. Create the disease, then sell the cure. Make people hate themselves, then offer redemption through obedience. The third essay attacks ascetic ideals, the religious and philosophical traditions that deny earthly existence in favor of otherworldly truth. Why do humans create ideals that contradict life? Because will to power operates even through denial. The ascetic priest gains power by claiming access to higher truth that others lack. The philosopher gains authority by claiming knowledge of eternal forms beyond physical reality. These ideals are life-denying, teaching people to hate their bodies, their desires, the only existence they'll ever have. But they persist because they give meaning to suffering. Better to suffer for a purpose, even false purpose, than to suffer meaninglessly. The ascetic ideal provides meaning, which humans need more than truth. The genealogy is devastating critique of Western civilization's moral and intellectual foundations. Nietzsche shows how supposedly eternal truths are historical constructions serving particular interests. He reveals the psychology underlying beliefs that claim to transcend psychology. But again, after demolishing existing values, he offers little concrete to replace them. Create new values, affirm life, become who you are. These are slogans, not programs. They don't tell us what to do tomorrow, how to organize society, how to live together once we've rejected shared moral framework. The book also shows Nietzsche's method at its best. He doesn't argue against Christianity philosophically, proving it false through logic. He traces its origins, showing how it emerged from specific historical conditions, how it served particular psychological needs. Understanding where beliefs come from undermines their claim to eternal truth. This genealogical method influenced later thinkers profoundly. Foucault, Derrida, postmodern philosophy generally, all use variations of this approach. Instead of asking whether beliefs are true, ask where they came from, whose interests they serve, what power relations they maintain. But the method has limits. Showing that a belief emerged from questionable origins doesn't prove it's false. Christian morality might have originated in resentment, but that doesn't mean compassion and equality are wrong. Genetic fallacy, criticizing ideas based on their origins rather than their merits. Nietzsche would respond that he's not committing genetic fallacy because he's not claiming Christian values are false. He's claiming they're harmful, life-denying products of weakness. Whether they're true in some abstract sense is irrelevant. What matters is their psychological effects. The genealogy also reveals Nietzsche's own psychology, his obsession with power and weakness, with strength and sickness, with noble versus slavish. All of this reflects his personal struggles. He was physically weak, chronically ill, socially isolated. His philosophy compensates for what he lacked in life. Does this invalidate his arguments? Or does it make them more powerful, showing that someone intimately familiar with weakness could still affirm strength? That someone drowning in suffering could still say yes to life? The question remains unanswerable. Act 2. The Frenzy. The year of writing dangerously. In 1888, Nietzsche entered a state of creative frenzy unprecedented in his career. He wrote with demonic intensity, producing 5 books in 12 months while his health deteriorated and his mental state became increasingly unstable. He moved to Turin in April, finding the city beautiful and the climate tolerable. His letters describe euphoria, periods of feeling better than he had in years. He walked for hours, thought clearly, wrote prolifically. He felt he was finally healthy, finally able to work without constant interruption from headaches and stomach problems. But something was wrong. The euphoria was too intense, too disconnected from his actual circumstances. He was still poor, still isolated, still unknown. Nothing external had changed, yet he felt triumphant, certain of his own importance, convinced he was about to transform human thought. In the summer, he wrote The Case of Wagner, attacking his former idol with vicious contempt. Wagner represented everything wrong with German culture: nationalism, anti-Semitism, Christian mysticism, decadent theatricality. Nietzsche tore him apart, showing how Wagner's music was manipulation, his philosophy was resentment, his entire project was poison. The attack was personal as much as intellectual. Nietzsche never fully recovered from the break with Wagner. This was his chance to explain why the break was necessary, why Wagner's influence had to be repudiated completely. But the prose is overwrought, the contempt too intense. It reads less like critique than revenge. Wagner had been more than mentor. He had been father figure, the powerful older man whose approval Nietzsche desperately sought. The relationship combined intellectual admiration with emotional neediness. When it ended, when Nietzsche recognized Wagner's anti-Semitism and Christian revivalism as corrupt, the loss was traumatic. The Case of Wagner is Nietzsche trying to kill Wagner in print since he couldn't kill his influence in his heart. The book reveals how much Wagner still mattered, how much Nietzsche still cared despite claiming not to. The intensity of the attack proves the depth of unresolved feeling. Then came Twilight of the Idols, written in just a few days, a condensed summary of his entire philosophy. The subtitle reveals the ambition, How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Nietzsche attacks every sacred cow: Socrates, Christianity, morality, truth itself. He's smashing idols, exposing lies, clearing ground for new values. The book is brilliant, aphoristic, quotable. But the tone has changed. Earlier works had wit and irony. This has contempt and fury. Nietzsche is not trying to persuade. He's pronouncing judgment, condemning the guilty, declaring war on everything Western civilization holds sacred. The writing comes easily, too easily. He produces pages per day that would take most philosophers months. The ideas flow without resistance. He feels inspired, possessed by insights that demand expression. This productivity feels like proof of his genius, confirmation that he's accessing truths others can't reach. But it might also be evidence of deteriorating judgment, of losing the critical faculty that would normally filter and refine ideas before committing them to paper. The line between inspiration and mania is thin, and Nietzsche might be crossing it without realizing. September brought the Antichrist, his most vicious attack on Christianity. The contempt is total, the language brutal. Christianity is not merely false. It's poison, disease, conspiracy against life itself. It must be destroyed completely or it will destroy humanity. The prose borders on hysteria. Nietzsche calls Christianity the one great curse, the one great intrinsic depravity. He proposes a new calendar beginning with the day Christianity died. He declares eternal war against Christian values. This isn't philosophy anymore. It's prophetic rage. Someone who believes he's seen ultimate truth and cannot bear that others remain blind. The book that was supposed to be the first part of his revaluation of all values became self-contained assault, everything compressed into pure attack. His letters from this period reveal the manic state. He writes to friends claiming perfect health, extraordinary productivity, certainty of approaching recognition. He says his books will split history in two. He compares himself to dynamite. He insists the world will soon realize what he's accomplished. To composer Peter Gast, he writes, "The world will be standing on its head for the next few years. Since the old God has abdicated, I shall rule the world from now on." To another friend, "I am now the most independent man in Europe." To his sister, "This year I have made such progress that I have left my earlier books far behind." But he also complains constantly about money, about his poverty, about publishers who won't pay adequately. The grandiosity coexists with petty practical concerns. One moment he's declaring himself a world historical figure. The next he's begging for small loans or complaining about meal costs. The contradiction doesn't register as contradiction to him. His mind is fragmenting, thoughts disconnecting, reality and fantasy bleeding together. But he interprets this as heightened clarity, as seeing more clearly than ever before. Ecce Homo. In October, Nietzsche began writing his autobiography, Ecce Homo. The title comes from Pontius Pilate presenting Christ to the crowd. Behold the man. Nietzsche is presenting himself as Antichrist, the man who will save humanity from Christianity's poison. The book is unlike any autobiography written. Chapter titles include Why I Am So Wise, Why I Am So Clever, Why I Write Such Good Books, and Why I Am a Destiny. The megalomania is explicit, undeniable. Nietzsche presents himself as world historical figure, comparable to Christ or Buddha, someone whose appearance divides history in two. But the book is also strangely self-aware. Nietzsche knows how grandiose he sounds. He anticipates objections, acknowledges that claiming to be a destiny seems mad, yet he insists it's true. He's not exaggerating. Future generations will recognize that he changed everything. The sections on his books are revealing. He explains what he was trying to do, what each work means, how they fit together. He's creating his own interpretation, trying to control how he'll be understood. He knows he's been misread, and he's terrified of being misread further. In Why I Am So Wise, he writes, "The good fortune of my existence, its uniqueness perhaps, lies in its fatality. I am to express it in the form of a riddle. Already dead is my father, while as my mother, I am still living and becoming old." This cryptic phrasing suggests he identifies with his dead father's release from life while possessing his mother's vitality. The psychology is complex, revealing both death wish and life affirmation. The most disturbing sections describe his health. He details the headaches, the near blindness, the digestive problems, but he presents them as signs of sensitivity, of constitution too refined for ordinary existence. He's not sick. He's too healthy for this diseased world. This inversion is everywhere. Loneliness proves his superiority. Poverty proves he's not corrupted by material concerns. Being ignored proves the world isn't ready for him. Every negative is reframed as positive, every failure as secret success. He describes his diet in obsessive detail. "I have the most exacting palate. I eat very little, but what I eat must be of the first quality. I cannot endure coffee. Alcohol is poison to me. Strong tea is good for me in the morning. I drink only water." The precision borders on madness. He's convinced that getting these details right will finally solve his health problems. The section on Thus Spoke Zarathustra reveals how seriously he takes that work. I shall now relate the history of Zarathustra. The fundamental conception of the work, the idea of eternal recurrence, this highest formula of affirmation that is at all attainable, belongs in August 1881. On that day I was walking through the woods along the lake of Silvaplana. At a powerful pyramidal rock not far from Surly, I stopped. It was then that this idea came to me. The final section, Why I Am a Destiny, declares that he's split history in two. Before Nietzsche, humanity lived in lies. After Nietzsche, truth is possible. He's brought daylight after millennia of darkness. He's enabled humanity to finally overcome itself. I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, hallowed so far. I am no man, I am dynamite. This is not rational assessment. This is grandiosity approaching delusion. Yet the writing itself is brilliant, the prose powerful, the insights genuine. How do we separate the disease from the philosophy? Can we trust thinking produced by a mind already beginning to fail? The book wasn't published until after his collapse. When it finally appeared, readers were disturbed by the megalomania. Some dismissed Nietzsche as madman. Others argued the megalomania was philosophical position, deliberate provocation, not symptom of disease. The debate continues. The Letters of Madness. In December 1888 and early January 1889, Nietzsche's letters changed. They became shorter, more cryptic, increasingly strange. He started signing them with mythological names: Dionysus, the crucified, even the monster. He wrote to friends claiming he was having all anti-Semites shot, that he had ordered Wilhelm II to come to Rome, that the world was transfigured. He addressed letters to royalty who didn't know him. He made claims that were obviously delusional. To his old friend Franz Overbeck. To friend Overbeck and wife. Although you have so far demonstrated little faith in my ability to pay, I yet hope to demonstrate that I am somebody who pays his debts, for example, to you. I am just having all anti-Semites shot. Dionysus. To August Strindberg, the Swedish playwright. Dear Sir, you will soon have an answer to your novelette. I have ordered a convocation of princes in Rome. I want to have the young Kaiser shot. Auf Wiedersehen, for we shall see each other again. Una sola condition. Let us divorce. Nietzsche, Caesar. But mixed with the delusions were moments of lucidity, passages that sounded normal. He discussed practical matters, asked about friends, made reasonable comments. The boundary between sanity and madness was blurring, thoughts fragmenting, control slipping. One letter to Jakob Burckhardt, his former colleague, is particularly revealing. Dear Professor, in the end I would much rather be a basal professor than God, but I have not dared push my private egoism so far as to desist for its sake from the creation of the world. You see, one must make sacrifices, however, and wherever one lives. The grandiosity is explicit. He's claiming to be God, to have created the world, but he's also joking about it, acknowledging it's absurd while insisting it's true. The irony and the delusion exist simultaneously, indistinguishable. Another letter to Cosima Wagner, Richard Wagner's widow. Ariadne, I love you. Dionysus. He's identifying with the god Dionysus, with primal life force, with everything wild and ecstatic. But he's also declaring love to a woman he barely knew, the wife of the man he'd spent years attacking. To another correspondent he wrote, To my maestro Pietro, sing me a new song. The world is transfigured and all the heavens rejoice. The crucified. He's mixing religious imagery with musical references, signing as Christ while claiming to have destroyed Christianity. These weren't communications anymore. They were symptoms, evidence of fracturing consciousness, thoughts disconnecting from reality, the self dissolving into mythological identifications. Friends who received these letters were alarmed. Something was catastrophically wrong. Overbeck rushed to Turin, finding Nietzsche alternating between singing, shouting, and unconsciousness. The collapse had arrived. Burckhardt received one of the strangest letters. I have had Caiaphas put in fetters. Also last year I was crucified by the German doctors in a very tedious manner. Wilhelm, Bismarck, and all anti-Semites abolished. The syntax is breaking down, the thoughts disconnecting, the boundary between self and historical mythological figures dissolving. His landlord, Davide Fino, later described these final days. He would sing, or rather scream, single phrases from operas, then fall into deep silence. Then suddenly, he would begin beating the piano with both fists, producing horrible discords. When I went into his room to quiet him, he would throw his arms around my neck and call me his friend. The collapse. The incident with the horse has become legendary, though details are disputed. Did it really happen? Some sources confirm it, others question it. But the story persists because it feels true to who Nietzsche was. A horse being beaten, suffering, unable to escape. Nietzsche seeing it and breaking, throwing himself at the animal, weeping, apologizing. The philosopher who attacked compassion as weakness, overwhelmed by compassion for suffering creature. The incident reveals the contradiction at Nietzsche's core. He preached hardness, strength, aristocratic distance from suffering. But he was soft, sensitive, traumatized by pain. He couldn't bear seeing suffering because he'd experienced so much himself. His philosophy was partly compensation, attempt to become what he wasn't. He praised strength because he was weak. He attacked compassion because he felt it too deeply. He called for hardness because he was too soft to survive without it. The collapse over the horse wasn't weakness overcoming philosophy. It was truth overwhelming compensation. The real Nietzsche, the man who couldn't bear suffering, breaking through the mask of the philosopher who praised strength. Carlo Fino, the son of his landlord, claimed to have witnessed it. My father and I were returning from market when we saw Nietzsche throw his arms around the neck of a horse and weep. The driver had been beating it because it refused to move. Nietzsche collapsed against the horse, then fell to the ground unconscious. We helped carry him back to his apartment. Or maybe the story is false, invented later. Too perfect to be true. Maybe he simply collapsed from disease, the syphilis finally destroying enough brain tissue to make normal functioning impossible. Maybe there was no horse, No dramatic moment, just gradual deterioration becoming sudden crisis. It doesn't matter. True or false, the story captures something essential. Nietzsche's philosophy couldn't save him from his humanity. The Übermensch remained imaginary. The man who tried to revalue all values ended in madness, unable to value anything. The horse stands as symbol of everything Nietzsche's philosophy couldn't account for. Innocent suffering, the impulse toward compassion, the recognition that some things are simply wrong, regardless of what any philosophy says. The breakdown of will to power when confronted with actual suffering. His landlord and neighbors helped him back to his apartment. For 2 days he lay in bed, occasionally lucid, mostly raving. He wrote the fragmentary letters, made grandiose claims, then fell silent again. The mind that had tried to think beyond good and evil could no longer think at all. When Overbeck arrived, he found Nietzsche in state impossible to describe adequately. Sometimes he seemed to recognize his old friend. Sometimes he called him by wrong names. Sometimes he seemed to be addressing Overbeck as if he were Wagner or God or some other figure from Nietzsche's mental landscape. The journey back to Basel was nightmare. Nietzsche would be calm for hours, then suddenly burst into singing or shouting. On the train, other passengers moved to different cars. Overbeck sat with his friend, watching the brilliant mind dissolve, unable to do anything except ensure he reached medical care. Act 3. The silence. The diagnosis. The psychiatric clinic in Basel diagnosed progressive paralysis, the final stage of syphilis. The disease had reached Nietzsche's brain, destroying tissue, causing the delusions, the mood swings, the eventual total collapse. When had he contracted it? Probably in his youth, possibly during his brief military service in 1867 to 1868 or at university. One encounter with devastating lifelong consequences. Syphilis was common in 19th century Europe, spread easily, and at that time completely incurable. The bacterium spirochete would lie dormant for years, then activate, usually attacking the nervous system. The progression was predictable. Primary symptoms appear within weeks, sore, rash. Secondary symptoms within months, fever, skin lesions. Then latency, sometimes for decades, the patient appearing healthy while the disease slowly spreads. Finally, tertiary syphilis, damage to heart, brain, nervous system. Nietzsche's headaches, vision problems, digestive issues, mood swings all could have been syphilitic symptoms. The disease might have been destroying him slowly for over 20 years, affecting his thinking long before the final breakdown. This raises terrible questions. How much of his philosophy was disease? Were his ideas products of deteriorating brain? Some scholars argue the syphilis diagnosis was wrong, that Nietzsche suffered from brain tumor, inherited mental illness, or other condition. The evidence is disputed. His medical records were incomplete. Diagnosis of neurological conditions in 1889 was primitive. We'll never know with certainty. But something organic was destroying his brain. Whether syphilis or tumor or some other disease, the physical cause was real. The question is how long it had been affecting him. Did the disease cause the philosophy, or did it merely end a philosophical career that had developed independently? The doctors at the Basel clinic were pessimistic. Progressive paralysis was terminal. The brain damage was irreversible. He would continue deteriorating until death, probably within a few years. There was no treatment, no cure, nothing to be done except maintain basic care and wait. His mother Franziska came to take him home to Naumburg. The formerly brilliant professor was now her dependent child, requiring constant care. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally muttering incoherently. He recognized no one. He showed no sign that the mind that had produced Thus Spoke Zarathustra still existed. She was 63 years old, taking on the burden of caring for a mentally shattered adult son. Her letters from this period describe the difficulty with painful honesty. He required feeding, bathing, constant supervision. He would sometimes become violent without provocation, requiring physical restraint. Sometimes he would play piano, pounding the keys violently. No melody, just noise. Sometimes he would sing, fragments of songs mixing with wordless sounds. Mostly he was silent, empty, a body without mind. His mother cared for him with devotion. despite never understanding his philosophy, despite believing his books were dangerous blasphemy. He was her son. She loved him regardless. She bathed him, fed him, managed his bodily functions, endured his occasional violent outbursts. Visitors who saw him during this period were shocked. The man who had written with such precision and force was reduced to babbling or silence. His eyes were empty. His body moved, but there was no person inside, no consciousness that could be reached through words or touch. Some visitors tried to reach him by reading from his own books. No response. They mentioned names of people who had been important to him. Nothing. They played music he had loved. Sometimes this produced reactions, but they were animal responses, not human recognition. The Nietzsche who had existed was gone. Elizabeth's control. When Franziska died in 1897, Nietzsche's sister Elizabeth took control. She moved him to Weimar, installed him in a house she renamed the Nietzsche Archive, and began managing his literary estate. This was catastrophe for Nietzsche's reputation. Elizabeth was everything Nietzsche despised: nationalist, anti-Semitic, conventional Christian, power-hungry. She had married Bernhard Forster, an anti-Semitic agitator who founded a pure German colony in Paraguay called Nueva Germania. The colony failed miserably. Forster committed suicide in 1889. Elizabeth returned to Germany, penniless, looking for opportunities. Her brother's fame provided the opportunity. Nietzsche's books were finally selling. Scholars were beginning to take him seriously. There was money to be made and power to be wielded through controlling his legacy. Nietzsche had broken with her over her marriage to Forster. In letters, he called Forster one of the criminals and warned Elizabeth that association with anti-Semitism would contaminate her. He wrote, "One of the greatest stupidities you have committed for yourself and for me is your association with an anti-Semitic chief. This accursed anti-Semitism is the cause of a radical break between you and me." But now she controlled his unpublished writings. She edited his notes, creating a book called The Will to Power that distorted his ideas to support her politics. She selected passages that could be read as supporting German nationalism, suppressed passages attacking it. She created the myth of Nietzsche, the proto-Nazi. She cultivated Nazi interest in his philosophy, welcomed Hitler to the Nietzsche archive in 1934, sold his image to the regime he would have despised. She allowed the Nazis to present Nietzsche as philosophical father of National Socialism, ignoring his explicit attacks on German nationalism and anti-Semitism. She created the myth of Nietzsche, the proto-fascist, the philosopher of blonde beasts and master race. Never mind that Nietzsche had explicitly attacked German nationalism, that he'd praised Jews as the strongest, toughest, and purest race now living in Europe, that he'd called himself a good European rather than German, that he denounced pan-Germanism as naive. Elizabeth's version became dominant. Nietzsche himself sat in his chair, blank-eyed, unaware that his name was being used to justify everything he'd opposed. The philosopher who attacked lies was being lied about. The thinker who demanded intellectual honesty was being dishonestly interpreted. He couldn't defend himself because he couldn't think. Elizabeth also created a spectacle. She turned Nietzsche into tourist attraction, charging admission to see the famous philosopher. Visitors would come to stare at the empty man in the chair, the legendary thinker reduced to vegetable state. Some left disturbed, others found it entertaining. She staged photographs showing her caring for her brother tenderly, creating an image of devoted sister nursing tragic genius. The reality was more complex. Her care was adequate but not affectionate. She saw him primarily as asset to be managed, corpse to be displayed, name to be exploited. Photographs from this period are haunting. Nietzsche sits or stands, his face slack, his eyes empty. Someone has dressed him in respectable clothes, combed his enormous mustache into its familiar shape. He looks like distinguished professor, but there's nothing behind the eyes, no sign of the mind that had tried to revalue all values. She published his letters selectively, editing out anything that contradicted her political agenda. She rewrote passages, changed emphasis, created a Nietzsche that never existed except in her imagination. She invented conversations that never happened, attributed ideas to him that he never held. Scholars wouldn't recover the real Nietzsche until decades later, after her death in 1935, when honest editions became possible. The complete letters, published in the 1970s and 1980s, revealed how thoroughly she had distorted the historical record. The death. On August 25, 1900, Friedrich Nietzsche died. The official cause was pneumonia, but really he'd been dead for 11 years, since that January morning in Turin when his mind shattered. He was buried in Rocken, the village where he was born, in the churchyard beside his father's grave. The irony was perfect. The philosopher who declared God dead, who attacked Christianity as poison, who called himself the Antichrist, was buried in Christian ceremony in consecrated ground. Elizabeth controlled the funeral, ensuring it was respectable, conventional, exactly what Nietzsche had rejected. No mention of his atheism, his attacks on Christianity, his revolutionary ideas. Just standard religious service, prayers for the dead, the assumption that he'd been good Christian despite everything he wrote. The grave marker is simple. His name, his dates, nothing about his philosophy. Tourists come now, leaving stones on the grave according to Jewish custom, photographing the site where the man who tried to kill God is buried beside a church. The final joke is on him, or on everyone else, depending on how you see it. But was he still Nietzsche when he died? The mind had gone 11 years earlier. What remained was body, biological functions, nothing recognizably him. The real death was in Turin. The burial in Rocken was just closing a corpse that had been walking for over a decade. Friends who attended the funeral reported that the service was brief, conventional, empty of meaning. They looked at the coffin, knowing that the person they'd known had died long ago. This was just final formality, putting the body in ground beside the father Nietzsche had psychologically struggled against his entire life. The weather was appropriate. Gray, drizzling, cold. A handful of people stood in the rain while a pastor who'd never read Nietzsche's work spoke platitudes about Christian comfort and eternal life. Everything Nietzsche had fought against was reasserted over his corpse. The pastor quoted scripture about resurrection and eternal life. The same promises Nietzsche had spent his career demolishing were now being spoken over his dead body. None of the mourners seemed to recognize or care about the irony. Peter Gast, his faithful friend and musical collaborator, attended despite being devastated. He had seen the collapse coming, had watched Nietzsche's letters become increasingly strange, but had hoped somehow it could be avoided. Standing at the grave, he wept not just for his friend, but for all the work that would now never be completed. Overbeck attended, silent and grieving. He had been with Nietzsche in the final moments of sanity, had witnessed the collapse, had arranged the medical care. He knew better than anyone how completely the brilliant mind had been destroyed. Elizabeth presided over everything, already planning how to use her brother's grave as pilgrimage site, how to turn his death into opportunity for promoting her version of his legacy. The questions that remain. How much of Nietzsche's philosophy was produced by a diseased brain? This question haunts every serious engagement with his work. If syphilis was destroying him for years before the breakdown, affecting his thinking, his moods, his judgment, then can we trust anything he wrote? The timing suggests his best work came before advanced disease. Beyond Good and Evil and Genealogy of Morals were 1886 and 1887, perhaps still early enough. The Antichrist and Ecce Homo were 1888, when disease was likely advanced. The quality difference is visible to many readers. The earlier works are controlled, argued, brilliant. The later works are brilliant, but unhinged. But maybe the disease enabled the insights. Maybe normal brain couldn't think what Nietzsche thought. Maybe the loosening of ordinary constraints allowed him to see what conventional thinking obscured. Maybe we need the disease to get the philosophy. This is dangerous reasoning. It romanticizes mental illness, suggests that madness and genius are linked, that to think differently requires being damaged. But it might also be true. Some insights require perspectives that healthy brains can't access. Or maybe the philosophy caused the madness. Maybe thinking that hard, pushing that far beyond conventional boundaries, attacking every foundation, rejecting every comfort, living in complete isolation with these ideas. Maybe that's what broke him. Not syphilis, but philosophy itself. Nietzsche would have liked this interpretation. The philosopher who went too far, who looked into the abyss until the abyss looked back, who climbed too high and froze in the thin air where normal humans cannot survive. Tragic but meaningful, destroyed by his own courage. But the medical evidence suggests otherwise. Syphilis explains everything: the headaches, the vision problems, the mood swings, the grandiosity, the final collapse. No need for romantic theories about philosophy causing madness. Disease caused madness. The philosophy was incidental, yet the philosophy survives. Over a century later, people still read Nietzsche, still argue about him, still find his ideas challenging and relevant. If the philosophy was just disease symptom, why does it still matter? Why hasn't it been dismissed like the ravings of any other syphilitic patient? Because the questions he asked remain urgent. Can morality survive God's death? Are we creating values or discovering them? Is compassion always good or sometimes weakness? Can humans overcome themselves? These questions don't depend on Nietzsche's mental state. They stand independent of his collapse. The tragedy is that we'll never know what Nietzsche might have become if disease hadn't destroyed him. Would he have moderated his positions, developed more systematic philosophy, found ways to answer the criticisms his work invited? Or would he have continued toward greater extremes, eventually saying things even his admirers couldn't defend? Some scholars argue he was already moderating before the collapse. Letters from 1888 show him planning works that would be less polemical, more constructive. He mentioned wanting to write about politics, about education, about how to actually live according to his philosophy, rather than just criticizing others. But we'll never see those books. The disease or the philosophy or both together destroyed the mind that might have written them. We're left with fragments, contradictions, brilliant insights mixed with obvious errors, prophecies that came true mixed with predictions that failed completely. The eternal return. Nietzsche's thought has returned eternally, just as he claimed everything would. Each generation rediscovers him, interprets him differently, finds new relevance in his attacks on truth, morality, religion, and conventional values. The Nazis claimed him, distorting his ideas into justification for their atrocities. Elizabeth's editing and promotion created a false Nietzsche that took decades to correct. Only after World War II did scholars begin recovering the real Nietzsche from her fabrications, showing his explicit attacks on nationalism and anti-Semitism, his cosmopolitanism, his celebration of cultural mixing. Existentialists embraced him, seeing in his work the recognition that we create meaning rather than discovering it, that we're free, and that freedom is burden. Sartre, Camus, Heidegger all wrestled with his ideas, trying to build on his insights while avoiding his excesses. Postmodernists found in him the ultimate skeptic, the thinker who exposed all truth claims as power plays, all knowledge as perspective. Foucault, Derrida, and others used his genealogical method, his suspicion of foundations, his insight that ideas serve interests. But every interpretation misses something. The Nazis missed his anti-nationalism and his contempt for anti-Semitism. The existentialists downplayed his elitism and his aristocratic radicalism. The postmodernists ignored his claims to have discovered truth about truth, his own absolute certainty about the absence of absolutes. Maybe Nietzsche is ultimately uninterpretable, too contradictory, too unsystematic, too deliberately provocative to fit any consistent reading. Maybe that's the point. He's not offering system but questioning every system, not building foundations, but showing foundations are artificial constructions. Contemporary culture still grapples with Nietzsche's legacy. Self-help gurus quote him about becoming who you are, missing the difficulty and danger of that project. Motivational speakers use "what doesn't kill you makes you stronger," without acknowledging that plenty of things kill you or leave you permanently damaged, as Nietzsche himself demonstrated. Pop culture reduces complex philosophy to inspirational memes that would have horrified him. But serious thinkers still engage with the hard questions. Bioethicists debate whether genetic enhancement might create Nietzsche's Übermensch. Political philosophers examine how democracy deals with his critique of equality. Psychologists explore how meaning-making works in a world without God. Environmentalists grapple with his implications for how we relate to nature. The man who collapsed over the horse, who spent 11 years in mental darkness, who was buried in the Christian cemetery he'd have despised, remains the most dangerous thinker in the Western canon. Not because he was right about everything. He wasn't. But because he questioned everything, refused every comfort, accepted no authority, and showed that we're all standing on foundations less solid than we'd like to believe. His madness doesn't invalidate his philosophy. If anything, it proves his point. He pushed thinking to its limits and discovered the limit was madness. The abyss gazes back. The eternal return crushes those who cannot bear it. The death of God creates vertigo that some cannot survive. Nietzsche didn't survive it, but his ideas did. They return eternally, challenging each generation to face uncomfortable truths, that morality might be constructed, that truth might be perspectival, that God might be dead, that we're more alone and more free than we want to acknowledge. The final years of Nietzsche's life show the price of thinking without guardrails, of questioning without limit, of living according to ideas that most humans wisely refuse to take seriously. He went as far as human thought can go. The destination was silence. But the path he carved remains. Every thinker who questions foundations, who suspects comfortable certainties, who demands intellectual honesty regardless of consequences, walks a path Nietzsche pioneered. He may have died in madness, but he lived in truth, or as close to truth as humans can approach. The horse stands in the piazza eternally, being beaten eternally. And eternally, someone throws his arms around its neck and weeps. The philosopher who preached hardness, overcome by softness. The man who tried to transcend humanity, discovering he never could. Perhaps that's the real lesson. We cannot transcend what we are. We can only understand it more clearly, accept it more honestly, live it more courageously. Nietzsche tried to become Übermensch and became patient instead. The gap between aspiration and reality destroyed him. But the aspiration was beautiful, the attempt was noble, the failure was human, and the ideas brilliant, dangerous, unresolved remain, waiting for each new generation to wrestle with them, to be challenged by them, perhaps to be destroyed by them. The eternal return continues. The questions persist. The abyss still gazes back at anyone brave or foolish enough to look into it. Friedrich Nietzsche looked, and he fell. But in falling, he showed us depths we didn't know existed. In breaking, he revealed fragilities we all share. In losing his mind, he forced us to question our own certainties. That's his legacy. Not answers, but questions. Not comfort, but challenge. Not certainty, but the courage to live without it. The silence that claimed him in Turin still echoes. Listen carefully. You might hear what destroyed him. You might recognize yourself in his collapse. You might discover that the distance between genius and madness is smaller than you'd like to believe. Nietzsche's tragedy was being right about too much while being wrong about what mattered most. He saw through civilization's lies, but couldn't survive the truth he discovered. He attacked weakness, but remained weak. He praised strength, but died helpless. The madness was not failure of philosophy, but its culmination. He thought as far as thinking can go. The destination was not transcendence, but dissolution. Not Übermensch, but silence. Not revaluation of all values, but loss of the ability to value anything. And yet, the books remain. The questions persist. The challenge endures. That's Nietzsche's immortality. Not fame or influence or historical importance, but the permanent presence of questions we can never fully answer, doubts we can never entirely dispel, challenges we can never completely meet. He failed, but his failure illuminates, his madness teaches, his silence speaks. The eternal return of Nietzsche continues. The ideas that destroyed him still have power to transform or destroy us. The choice is ours. But make no mistake, the choice has consequences. Nietzsche showed us the destination. Genius, isolation, madness, silence. The horse waits in the piazza. Someone will always weep.